Okay, awesome. Great. Well, it's great to be here. Thanks for having us. We're excited to see what folks might build with cycles and the concepts in cycles. We wrote this paper about a year and a half ago. We've been building kind of in stealth since then a privacy preserving version of this. We're developing what we're calling the shielded graph, which is a variant of a shielded pool that allows you to do all the cool cycles clearing stuff fully in private using zero knowledge proofs and trusted execution environments. But today I'm really just going to focus on the conceptual model behind cycles, because cycles is really a new way of approaching the concepts of finance and settlement from a different perspective that's fundamentally capital efficient and that takes into account the network structure of reality. So we're so used in finance and to thinking about bilateral transactional mechanics, and cycles really zooms out to look at this kind of multilateral network level view and enables entirely new kinds of applications, or I should say, existing applications to be built in entirely new ways, like DEXs and lending protocols and, invoice discounting and all these kinds of things. And of course, we want to do it all privately with TEs and zero knowledge proofs, but even just the concepts themselves give a lot to play with. So I'm hoping folks will find some inspiration in the concepts and play around with what can be built. So, at a high level, what we're doing is saying, look, the world is not a spot market of assets, despite what mainstream models and everyone in cryptocurrency will tell you. It's not a place where you just like barter goods. It's a network of balance sheets. And so what we've done with cycles is really started from first principles to say, okay, let's take the basics of balance sheets, which is double entry bookkeeping, and graph theory, which represents the network, and combine them in a remarkably simple kind of way that gives rise to a new approach to finance and settlement. And as we like to say, respects the graph because really takes advantage of the network structure of reality and services that. And so I'm just going to jump right into the design. And at a high level, this is really all it boils down to. This is how Cycles views the world. Essentially, all agents and currencies are nodes in the graph, right? And the fact that both agents and currencies are nodes is kind of key here and is one of the core insights. Currencies are just another kind of agent, and the line between what a currency is and what an IOU of a person is or a company is really starts to blur, and that's kind of the point. So all agents and currencies are nodes in the graph. All nodes are balance sheets, which means they have assets and liabilities. All relations between nodes are directed edges in the graph. So really what Cycles is articulating is a kind of a different form of account abstraction, right? The idea is every account in our blockchains are nodes in the graph that are represented by balance sheets. And what the accounts do with each other, the main action they do is they create these directed edges between them. That's what actually constitutes the graph, right? And there are two kinds of edges, and this is it. You can build our argument is you can build all of finance from two kinds of edges. And we call them obligations and acceptances. So an obligation is a directed edge from a debtor to a creditor. This is a standard liability, IOU. We call it a commitment to a past or an existing liability. An acceptance is sort of future looking. It runs from a creditor to a debtor. It's saying, I'm willing to be owed by you in the future. It's a commitment to a future liability. It's like an extension of credit. We'll see a bunch of examples of this. And then this is kind of the key insight of Cycles, is that every settlement, every payment is a cyclic flow within the graph. And we'll see very concretely what that means. And then finally, the last piece of the mechanics here is that essentially acceptances become obligations in the future. So if I'm extending credit to you, it means that you're going to owe me in the future. That's the nature of credit. So with these kind of simple set of principles, we actually have an entirely new model of execution and settlement for accounts on chain that is multilateral and that respects the graph. So let's dive into a bit more detail on what all this means. I'll start just with a clearer explanation of obligations and balance sheets. On the left are two balance sheets for Alice and Bob. Each has assets and liabilities. Alice has $20 and she transfers the $20 to Bob. There's no liabilities involved in this picture. This is how people normally think about payments and settlements. Alice has $20, she transfers it to Bob. But what we're interested in is why she transferred the $20, right? What purpose did transferring the $20 serve? It's almost certainly because she already owed Bob $20, right? And that's what's shown on the right, is that there's actually an obligation from Alice to Bob. Alice has a liability of $20 owes to Bob, and Bob has a corresponding asset, a receivable, $20 owed from Alice. And so the reason Alice is going to transfer $20, which isn't shown here on the right, is because she has that obligation to Bob. So it's those obligations that we feel are chronically underrepresented in our payment systems and in our in our blockchains that are not being put on chain. And if we do put them on chain, we can work with them in very interesting ways because they form dense networks, right? In the real world economy, there's all kinds of obligations, people owing each other. You have a whole network, you have all kinds of structure in there. And Cycles, the goal of Cycles and the conceptual model of Cycles is to surface this structure and emphasize that liquidity is actually a topological property of the graph. Liquidity arises out of the structure of the graph. And that is profound because it means you can do more with less by taking advantage of the graph structure, and you can open the door to all kinds of new ways to build capital efficient financial applications that blockchains are perfect for, but haven't been built yet because, well, Cycles is still kind of new. So how does it actually work? I mean, this is really the basic intuition is that when there is a closed loop of obligations, Alice owes Bob, Bob owes Carol, Carol owes Alice, you can reduce all of them by the smallest one, right? So we call that set off. In this case, the smallest obligation is 20 from Alice to Bob. And so all three obligations can be reduced by 20. In other words, we're able to clear $60 worth of debt without any money having to move at all, right? So these debts are simply uploaded into Cycles or into an application like Cycles. Cycles realizes, hey, there's a closed cyclic loop here. And so we can do set off. That's what we call this kind of operation. Set off, we can do set off of all of these obligations by the smallest amount. We don't have to change anybody's counterparties. We don't have to introduce any new counterparties. There's no new risks created. We can just compress everyone's balance sheets, reduce all these obligations, clear the debt without any money having to move, right? So this is kind of the base case of applying set off to obligations. And this is powerful in its own right. But we want to actually generalize from this because this doesn't have acceptances yet. There's no actual new extensions of credit. There's no currencies involved here. This is just kind of pure set off. And what Cycles will make Cycle different from existing clearing solutions or other netting solutions is that it uses set off rather than netting. In other words, it doesn't change. It doesn't change counterparties. It doesn't change who owes who. All it does is reduce the total amounts owing here. And that's why we like to say respect the graph, because we respect and preserve the graph of obligations. So let's generalize by introducing acceptances. And this is actually what happens every time Alice pays Bob using bank money. Alice has money in the bank. She has $20 in the bank, which means the bank has a liability to Alice. That's how it's represented on the bank's balance sheet. That's what Alice's money is when she has bank money. And Alice owes Bob $20 because Bob sent her an invoice for some goods. And now we introduce the acceptance, which is a directed edge from Bob to the bank. This is saying that Bob is willing to accept bank money in payment of this debt, right? And so now we actually see that we have a cycle, a triangle between these three parties. And so when we find this cycle and apply the set-offs, we get the image on the right, where the two debts from the bank to Alice and Alice to Bob have been cleared, and now Bob has the money in the bank. In other words, Bob's acceptance to the bank has become an obligation from the bank, right? And so what's so powerful about this, I mean, this is happening every time you make a payment, whether people realize it or not. But the point is that every payment is a cycle, whether you like it or not. When you just represent the world in terms of obligations and acceptances, every payment is a cycle. And so we want to really capitalize on that opportunity to show that, hey, we don't just have to do these three cycles with banks or liquidity sources. We can do much more complicated cycles. First, let's replace the bank with USDC, right? We're doing this on chain. We're trying to get rid of banks. We can represent any kind of liquidity source, even if it doesn't have agency, even if it doesn't have a private key that's able to control its account, we can represent them as special liquidity nodes within the graph. So USDC in escrow on chain is just another node in the graph. And when Alice has USDC in Cycles, it's represented as an obligation from the USDC node. That's what it means. This is the kind of account abstraction thing I'm talking about. Alice doesn't just have coins sitting in her account. It's literally represented on chain as an obligation from the USDC node. And so we call this tendering. Alice is tendering her funds into the graph. And of course, Bob, also has an acceptance. This is really the exact same image as before. We've just replaced the bank with USDC just to make this sort of more blockchain native. And this is what we can do on chain. Now, another use of acceptances is as credit lines. So suppose Alice didn't have money in the bank, but the bank was willing to extend her credit. So in this case, the bank would actually have an acceptance to Alice, right? And that means the bank is willing to be owed by Alice in the future. That's what an acceptance is. And so once again, we have a cycle, right? Bob is willing to accept money to the bank, and the bank is, in a sense, willing to accept the money of Alice, which is what it means to extend credit, right? And so once you find this cycle and the setoffs are applied, you get the image on the right. The debt from Alice to Bob has been cleared, and now Alice owes 20 to the bank, and the bank owes 20 to Bob. In other words, Bob has $20 in the bank. So what this shows is how we can actually start to blur the line between the willingness to accept a currency and to extend credit to someone. They're really the same kind of fundamental concept of an acceptance, which is a commitment to a future obligation, right? They're the same thing, and we can use them in the same way within the graph. Another really cool example, if we get rid of the bank and we just have Alice owes Bob owes Carol, if Carol is willing to extend credit to Alice, even without actually giving her any money, then the debts from Alice to Bob and Bob to Carol can be cleared, and you just have Alice owing Carol. So we call this a kind of peer-to-peer loan. It's a peer-to-peer credit extension. Carol has an acceptance to Alice, meaning effectively that she's willing to be owed by Alice instead of Bob. And the benefit of this is that a whole bunch of debt in the network can clear as a result of her being willing to do this, right? So this is a really cool kind of application that you could build where you have a bunch of debts in the network and you surface the possibility of extending credit to someone in order to clear a large amounts of the debts. Now, obviously, you could layer in interest rates and other kinds of rewards for Carol to have the incentive to do this, but this benefits potentially many other players in the network. So these were simple sort of three-party examples. Of course, we can extend it to more. Here, Alice owes Bob owes Carol. Alice has money in the bank. Alice has USDC. If she tenders it, then Cycles can do the clearing, and 100 from Alice gets sent to Carol. So now Carol has the USDC, and the debts from Alice to Bob and from Bob to Carol are cleared, right? So obviously we can, you can imagine many more participants, and obviously the numbers don't have to be perfectly equal. That this is just for illustrative purposes, but you can see the kind of benefits compounding as the network grows. Another, just to give you an idea of like the kinds of applications you can build and sort of how you can, think about the benefits of building applications on the graph, I want to introduce the notion of a discount ladder. So, it's very common in trade finance if I have an invoice owing to me, I issued you an invoice, you owe me, and I want to get paid now, but the invoice isn't due for, 30 days or 60 days. It's very common for me to try to sell the invoice to someone else who's willing to give me money now at a discount and collect from you later on. It's it's a massive industry. And it's quite predatory, and the interest rates that are paid, the discount rates are quite high, and you usually need to find an external liquidity provider to do that. Cycles allows you to do a kind of matching thing in the graph, right? Where, let's say in this case, Alice owes Bob owes Carol. Alice has money and would like to pay early if she can get a discount, right? Maybe the invoice isn't due for 30 days, but she's happy to pay now if she can get a 1% discount. On the other hand, Carol is trying to get paid, and she would like to get paid early, and she's willing to take a haircut. She'll take a 2% discount if she can get paid early. Now, normally, here, Alice and Carol aren't directly connected. There's Bob between them, and Bob doesn't care about the discount. Bob just, Bob wants to be paid in full because he owes Carol in full, and so he wouldn't normally be aware, but he's willing to participate in set off. He's willing to have his receivable offset his payable, right? And so Cycles can discover this match by introducing these special discount liquidity nodes. So USDC discounted at 1%, USDC discounted at 2%. For every percentage discount, we would have a different node in the graph. And Alice would be saying, okay, well, I'm willing to, I'll put $99 in, and that will give me $100 worth of obligation from the 1% discount node that I can try to use to pay my debts early. And Carol is saying, well, I'm willing to accept at a discount. I'll have an acceptance to the 2% discount node. And Cycles, again, can find this loop and can allow this matching to occur so that Alice's money gets used essentially to pay Carol at a discount. And so this is actually going to generate, if you do the math here, there'll be a $1 surplus because Alice put in $99. She got a 1% discount. Carol's going to receive $98 because of this 2% discount. And that extra dollar can be used by the protocol to incentivize this, or to be, stashed away in a treasury for future allocations or whatever. So that matching also enables, also creates a spread, in this particular example, that creates surplus that can be used later. So we think this is a very, very powerful example, and is kind of the direction we're going with the sort of applications we want to be able to build with Cycles. Another Perhaps even more inspiring or interesting application is a DEX. It's a new kind of DEX that is possible that you can create even without any trade obligations within the network, just by thinking about the cycles graph structure. And here, I'm using a bunch of Cosmos coins because this example was formulated, I don't know, 2 years ago when these prices were more accurate. So, excuse the collapse of Cosmos coins in the meantime. But the idea here is you basically represent every price tick as a node in the graph, and then you can represent bids and offers as acceptances and obligations from those different nodes, and then you can find a cycle across different currencies. And so here we have Alice and Bob and Charlie and Dana, each trying to buy and sell a different currency, and cycles can actually find the closed loop across all of these between the obligations and acceptances in here. It's a little bit messy. I'll share a Python notebook after that sort of has this example, so you can play around with it. But this enables an entirely new kind of DEX. It's a multilateral, multi-asset, limit order book DEX that with batched execution, where the batches don't have to execute at a single price, because it allows this, a multilateral sort of expression of preferences over prices, and it allows you to optimize to clear the greatest amount of volume, the greatest amount of trade, rather than just looking for the broadest spread. So this is something that doesn't exist, out there. It gives rise to very sort of interesting dynamics in terms of what can be built with a DEX. Arguably, if you were to actually build this, it would be the slowest DEX on the market by design. You can imagine it as sort of like a generalized cow swap, but we think this is super powerful, and we'd love to see someone build this. So given all of that, I'm once again asking you to respect the graph and the power of the graph, and the ability to build very cool kinds of applications that have entirely new properties and benefit from capital efficiency by virtue of doing this on the graph. So once you have this dense graph of obligations and acceptances, and you've built applications that create all these edges and nodes, then you're faced with the optimization problem of actually finding the cycles, right? And so the simple thing to do is run min cost max flow. There are standard libraries for this. When you then subtract that flow from the graph, what you're left with is the cyclic structure, and that cyclic structure is essentially the set of the set-offs that you then apply to the obligations and acceptances to reduce them. But the optimization problem here opens all kinds of interesting possibilities for how you actually distribute the benefits of clearing, because the solutions aren't necessarily unique. And so you can run the optimization in different ways. You can optimize for slightly different things for different kinds of benefits. Now, if you want to do this all in a privacy preserving way, this is the part that would actually run in the trusted execution enclave. And the way we do things, we're actually generating a zero knowledge proof of the results of all of this. So that there's a bunch of complexity and complication involved in doing that I won't get into. But if you want to explore zero knowledge circuitry for this kind of graph solving, that would also be super interesting. So just one more kind of example to sort of hammer things home about multi-currency. Again, this is old and Cosmos based, but you can basically have graphs in multiple currencies that intersect with each other. So here, A owes B owes C, and A is willing to pay in USDC, and C is willing to accept it. D owes B owes E, D is willing to pay in Atom, E is willing to accept it. And so you have, you can imagine that there's a price oracle that's just like quoting the Atom price in dollars here. And so both of these loops are able to clear. B benefits from both currencies without touching either currency. B is just getting setoffs, right? But even if B didn't owe C and D didn't owe B, so we can't close loops in individual currencies, we can still close a loop across both currencies, right? So what this means is that essentially a small number of people being willing to use different currencies can actually benefit a much larger number of people who don't use them. So that's it on the design. On the applications you can build, I mean, I've sort of been talking about as I've been going through. You can build the basic multilateral clearing. We can do it, privately in a TEE. What we'd love to see is someone build Splitwise. If you're familiar with Splitwise, it's for small groups of friends to net out their who paid for what when you go on a trip together, or roommates or whatever. But it only works with small trusted groups of friends, right? So a cycles-based design would allow you to expand it to a broader based groups, or to do clearing between mutually overlapping groups. Maybe you went on different trips or paid for different things with different groups because you're all at a conference for a week. We'd love to see a version of this app using cycles that that people could use at conferences, just to settle up at the end of the conference after all the payments. Another, very cool application is Circles UBI. You might be familiar with a graph-based currency system based on transitive trust. This can actually be implemented in the Cycles model. So it's not currently, it's sort of its own design, but you can layer the Circles application on top of the underlying Cycles framework, which would allow that application to tap into the larger network's effects. I'm out of time here, but I've touched on all of these things: P2P lending, the discount ladder we talked about, the very cool new kind of DEX. We'd love to see any of these things built. So I'll wrap up here. There's plenty more detail. I can share some of this and some more notes on how it all works. But good luck to all the hackers here, and excited to see what you'll build.